John Locke was born during the 30 Years' War, a devastating conflict that enveloped most of Central Europe between 1618 and 1648, killing 8 million people and destroying vast tracts of farmland. This horrific war had its roots in the divisions of the Protestant Reformation a century earlier, even as the war also went beyond theological battles to involve money, territory, power, and the political organization of Europe. While the origins of the 30 Years' War are complex, it's clear that a precipitating cause was the fragmentation of Christendom in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. The breakup of the Roman Catholic Church helped to lead to the crack-up of Europe and to a century of violence that culminated in the 30 Years' War. This experience of growing up in a time of religious and cultural conflict and violence shaped the viewpoints of the European thinkers who launched an intellectual program that became known as the Enlightenment. The basic premise of the Enlightenment was the search for grounds of knowledge that would be non-controversial or non-partisan, rooted in universally recognizable and measurable realities. Rather than beginning with the Bible as a source book of reliable knowledge, that is, revealed religion, Enlightenment thinkers sought to find a ground of knowledge in the natural order of things. Depending on whether they were Protestant or Catholic, Enlightenment thinkers may have had theological opinions about the teaching of the Bible, for example, about the sacraments, whether in the Eucharist the wine and the bread becomes in substance the flesh and blood of Christ, or whether it is simply a representation or recollection of Jesus' actual flesh and blood. But even if they had theological opinions about a matter such as that, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke were looking for a prior ground of knowledge that would be trustworthy beyond mere opinion, at least in the context of the practical and natural world. In other words, Enlightenment thinkers were not necessarily people without faith. Their experience was that revealed religion, based on the Bible, while valuable, was a source of great violence and turmoil, and so they sought practical certainty in a different place, the natural and physical world as explored through the scientific method. This world was accessible and recognizable and measurable through a method of inquiry that was nonpartisan, accessible to Protestants and Catholics, and for that matter Hindus and Muslims, to anyone who applied the scientific method of reasoning. During the Reformation era of the early 1500s, the humanism of the Renaissance celebrated human capacities for beauty and art and eloquence, leading to a hopeful vision of human progress based in the recovery of the primary sources of Scripture, such as the Hebrew and Greek texts of the Bible, along with their translation into vernacular languages available to anyone. Luther and the Reformers thought that by making the Bible available to everyone, a new consensus about the truth of God and the world found in the Bible would emerge from the light of the Bible. Instead, the outcome of everyone reading the Bible is that everyone disagreed about what was in the Bible and how to interpret it. The Bible, far from being a ground of unity, was a ground of violence and endless conflict. The dawn of the Enlightenment, with its concern to describe and measure the world as it is, trusted human reason alone with the capacity to see what the world is really like. In the first stage of the Enlightenment, the emphasis was on doubting everything that could not be proven from first principles, such as the famous dictum stated by René Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." This early stage of the Enlightenment reflected Plato's idea that knowledge is hardwired into our minds. Our task is simply to recall it through careful thought. John Locke, on the other hand, is part of the middle stage of the Enlightenment, shaped more by Aristotle's empirical methods of observation and documentation. The task is to empty the mind of presuppositions and to try to give an account of the world as it actually is. This is what Locke is trying to do in the essay concerning human understanding that we are reading and discussing in our class. He is examining the relationship between words and the ideas or objects to which they refer with a careful scientific scrutiny. He wishes that this relationship were simple and direct, but he observes that there is really an arbitrary relationship between words and the ideas to which words refer. Ideas don't naturally give rise to certain words. The relationship between ideas and words is learned when we learn a language. and this relationship is only reliable when we are recording our own ideas with words, when we are speaking or writing to ourselves. We know what we mean when we use certain words, but as he observes, when we try to communicate our ideas to others using certain words, we can't be sure that the word we are using evokes the same idea in our neighbor as it does in our own mind. That is why he writes in Book 3, Chapter 9, Number 4, this is in the second column on page 817, he writes that, quote, "The chief end of language in communication being to be understood, words serve not well for that end, neither in civil nor philosophical discourse, when any word does not excite in the hearer the same idea which it stands for in the mind of the speaker," end quote. He then goes on to list all the reasons why words are not reliable for accurate communication. For example, it might be that the idea a word stands for is complex, an idea that incorporates numerous concepts in ways that vary from person to person. Take the word freedom, for example. That word might refer to a legally binding civil liberty, such as the right to vote or the right to bear arms, or it might refer to an inner experience of spiritual liberty or the empowerment to make a hard choice. It could also include an organizational flexibility to work at home or to flex hours. It might mean all of those at the same time to someone, or none of those and something else altogether for someone living in, say, Canada or Russia or China. These are ideas that Locke calls mixed modes. He doesn't hold out much hope for accurate communication about these kinds of ideas. Second, it might be the case that an idea does not have a direct connection to an observable physical event, a standard in nature, as he puts it. Here Locke uses the examples of murder or sacrilege. If someone kills another person or defaces a church building, these events by themselves do not carry with them the qualities that make them murder or sacrilege. In order to accuse someone of murder, we need to explore their motives. We need to consider the provocation for the killing. We need to establish some intentionality, and so on. These are not qualities that are immediately available for observation. Only the act of killing is certain. So we may disagree on whether something is murder or manslaughter or just a terrible accident. Locke points out that much of the Bible is dealing with just these kinds of mixed mode ideas that do not have a direct connection with an observable physical event, partly because the texts originate in an ancient world that is obscure to us, that we cannot observe for ourselves. Locke notes that there are simple ideas in the world to which words may refer without much ambiguity, such as white and sweet, or yellow and bitter. However, there are some such simple ideas that also carry with them other meanings. For example, gold may be a color, or a particular kind of metal, or a sign of wealth. We might note from our vantage point that the simple idea of white is actually a mixed mode that carries meanings of race and privilege, not only in our time, but back in Locke's time as well, even if he was unwilling to recognize it. So what is the relationship between words and reality for Locke? He makes it clear that the connection between words and ideas is always arbitrary, which makes communication challenging most of the time. He notes, however, that there are natural sensations that arise from our contact with the world, which give rise to ideas, and this relationship is sometimes arbitrary and sometimes not. For example, the idea of a circle is naturally related to the sensation of a circle, likewise a rectangle, and likewise the presence of 5 circles versus 2 circles. But most sensations do not naturally lead to a certain idea. Seeing a tree or a horse do not naturally lead to a clearly defined idea of what a tree is or what a horse is. Elsewhere in Locke's philosophy, he refers to this as the difference between a primary quality or a secondary quality. A primary quality is something that is intrinsic to an object, its size, motion, number, etc. A secondary quality is something I attribute to the object, its color, any sound it makes, and so on. Locke wishes that there would be a natural and intrinsic relationship between any object or event and the world and the idea that arises in my mind of that object or event. He wishes that there would be a natural and intrinsic relationship between any idea that I might have or try to convey and the words I use to convey them. That way we could all know for sure what we are seeing when we see something, or what we are talking about when we try to describe our experiences of seeing to one another. But he realizes when he studies how language works that these relationships are mostly arbitrary, even for scientists who are quite careful about how they use words. This explains why he is so bitterly against rhetoric. It's hard enough to understand one another when we are working hard to only describe accurately what we observe and think. We may as well give up when people start practicing eloquence in the art of rhetoric. We can see both his cynicism toward rhetoric and his misogyny, his disdain for women, in the last sentence of the essay. Eloquence, he writes, like the fairer sex, which as we know is women, has two prevailing beauties in it to suffer itself ever to be spoken against. And it is vain to find fault with those arts of deceiving, wherein men find pleasure to be deceived. It appears, does it not, that Locke, who so opposed eloquence, cannot help but practice a bit of it himself here, in his little diatribe against the art of rhetoric.